Welcome to our second lecture on In Our Time in the Hemingway Code. By the end of this lecture, you should be able to understand the 10, at least an overview of the 10 principles of the Hemingway Code, and how characters in Hemingway's cycled short story collection In Our Time exemplify a few principles of the code, or do not exemplify the principles of a code. So Hemingway once he's established through his associative cycling the objective correlative of the dominant emotion of despair and frustration and despondency with the ubiquity of violence and cruelty toward the innocent in the modern era, he spent his life's work In Our Time, Farewell to Arms, Sun Also Rises, For Whom the Bell Tolls, creating characters who exhibit characters of what has come to be known as the Hemingway Code, characteristics of what have come to be known as the Hemingway Code, and characters who fail to. So you sort of have the Hemingway hero and subordinate characters who follow code principles that ultimately wind up making the 10 principles of the Hemingway Code. And you have characters who fail to. So he could either get at defining how to live in this modern world of violence and racism and cruelty by showing characters who exhibit positive principles of the code, or characters who do not. So let's take a look at some of the principles in front of us. First, let's look at one of the things he said in The Old Man and the Sea, which I think will be informative for us. Which is, he said, he said, a man can be destroyed, but not defeated. And so that's a puzzling idea. What's the difference between being destroyed and being defeated? It seems pretty similar, but the idea here is that a man can be emotionally destroyed, psychologically destroyed, physically destroyed, as Hemingway was, a shot in the leg in World War I, handing out chocolates as an ambulance driver on the Italian front. But they cannot be ultimately defeated. That is, if they maintain an adherence to code principles, they meet life on their own terms. They meet death on their own terms, and they establish an order through the chaos that is life, which gives them hope, at least in the individual will, as opposed to God's will or divine providence. Let's look at some of the principles here and get familiar with them. So the first one is to speak through action. So these are all characteristics of the Hemingway hero here, or the coded hero more particular. So what does it mean? Don't be windy, messy, flamboyant. And don't be a braggart. Don't be self-indulgent or self-aggrandizing in your speech to convey the code. You are wholly what you do, not what you say you do, or say you will do, or say you have done. So, every moment in Hemingway's personal life, the adventures he went on and sought out, and the wars he sought out, remember World War I, and again World War II, he knew that every day, every moment was a chance for him to be defined by his actions, not by what he hopes to be able to do. So we'll look for that in text. Avoid self-pity. So here's this existential despair that we all live in lives in struggles against destruction. We all live in this modern era of despair and frustration with war and violence and racism and lack of social mobility. But don't eddy in your own weakness or despair about what has been done to you by forces you can't control, because this leads to a disinclination to action. So 1 and 2 work together, right? You avoid self-pity, you avoid the soldier in the foxhole saying, "Oh, Jesus Christ, please save me, outside force, right? Please save me." And that is that leads to a disinclination to action. That leads to an individual who's hoping for some outside divine providence to come and save him from being killed at war, as opposed to doing things well at war to save themselves. And again, number 3, complete tasks well. There is honor, there is dignity, there is a sense of nobility in doing whatever you do well that helps shape the self. So maintain discipline and honor in the means by which you complete tasks. Strive for noble ends, even if you don't achieve them, and finish what you start. Okay? Or at least attempt to finish what you start when sometimes forces outside your control prevent you from doing so. Think of Robert Jordan in his last moments on the pine needle forest, um, holding off at the very last moments the oncoming fascist fighters, and so Maria can escape safely. Certainly, he's not able to complete that task well, but he maintains honor and discipline in doing it as well as he possibly can. Okay, value nature. Certainly, nature is a big part of Hemingway's life and in his stories, but we don't deify nature like the Romantics. We don't worship it. We develop an appreciation of its beauty, its intricacy, its wholeness as therapeutic to the self, but also there's a sentence, emerging environmentalism in Hemingway, that there is an obligation for the individual who sees nature as a means, as an arena in which to display his moral code, not just value nature, but to contribute to its wholeness, contribute to its ability to sustain itself. Let's look at that. Number 5 is be faithful in and to love. Even though Hemingway had many wives and there are many positive and destroyed relationships in his books, he believed in love as an antidote to despair, as a cleansing from what has been done to you beyond your control, and to maintain fidelity in love. It seems ironic since he had so many wives. However, he was faithful to love. It just sometimes love would come and find him in moments when he was in love with another woman. But nonetheless, we're going to look for characters who are strong in themselves and their belief in themselves, and therefore in their world, because their faithfulness to and in love. Experiential knowledge over book knowledge, right? Be skeptical of any knowledge divorced from experience, and admire those who are expert from experience. So this connects to, valuing coded people, valuing solidarity. The only knowledge worth having and carrying with you is knowledge gained from experience, and ultimately, even the best knowledge, experiential knowledge, is that which it remains uncommunicated but understood amongst those who are of the same tribe, flat fishermen on a stream, how to handle trout without harming them, hunting in the field, knowing when not to take a shot if you're not going to be able to kill the bird or deer or antelope instantly. And certainly experiential knowledge at war. Take responsibility for wrongs. Don't blame others for wrongs caused by yourself, and take action to ameliorate wrongs, even if, especially if, the situation cannot be positively resolved. So, sort of common sense principle here, but we have a tendency to shift the blame to others or shift the blame to the context. But Hemingway, in many of his characters, shows that individuals who are able to accept their shortcomings, accept the wrongness of their actions, and move on and cleanse themselves by doing other things well, or by contributing to improving the wrong that they committed. We'll see that often in For Whom the Bell Tolls. Embrace the present. You are what you do now, not what you have done or will do. In the face of adversity, hold on to your stoic and enduring faith in yourself without despair. And so, beyond embrace the present, there's a sense in Hemingway's code to self-assess, and that is to not overvalue the praise or condemnation given to you by others. Do things well for yourself and value your self-awareness of a clean line with a maximum exposure. So, that's a phrase from The Sun Also Rises. But the idea here is that there is a self separate from the self that's perceived by others. And it's important in Hemingway's characters, those who become coded heroes, to look internally at the self and honestly assess who you are. And that's the self that matters, not the self that others perceive you as. Certainly Pedro Romero in The Sun Also Rises exemplifies that as one who knows he is a coded individual in love and in bullfighting. And finally, valuing solidarity. Develop and maintain faith in others who embody and exhibit the other principles of the code. Surround yourselves with people who have the experiential knowledge, who live by the principles of the code, and become mentors for you. And there are many mentors. Count Greffy, Santiago is a mentor for Manolin in The Old Man and the Sea, who live their lives by completing tasks well, by self-assessing, by taking responsibility for their wrongs. And these are the people that you surround yourselves by, and by being with them and watching them in certain situations and conduct themselves, there's an implicit code to their actions that works osmotically on the individual, if you will, rubs off on the individual by being around them. So to surround yourself with coded individuals and value that solidarity, value that companionship is important to Hemingway, and we see that often, especially in his life in Sun Valley, and we'll talk about that as the course goes on. So let's continue down the line here, and I think we're on to the next. With how to write this, ultimately you're going to write a paper on a principle in Hemingway's works, and you're going to run that principle, say it's self-assess all the way through the texts In Our Time, the short stories, Photo Arms, Sun Also Rises, Old Man of the Sea, For Whom the Bell Tolls. But there's two ways to do it. You have to do both. One is to define by negation, which is an effective method in beginning to define a principle by showing what the principle is not, or who does not embody this principle. So, for example, Robert Cohn in For Whom the Bell Tolls, an example of a character who Robert Cohn in The Sun Also Rises, cannot self-assess or accurately view himself, and who only values what others think of him. Okay? This is a great way to help your reader understand what the principle is not and who does not embody this principle. Ernest Hemingway's works are replete with code breakers. So defining by negation, showing what self-assessment is not. Cohn only values what Brett thinks of them and what others think of him in his relationship with Brett. Now, definition by affirmation. This is the one that will make up most of your paper. This is a positive method of defining, illustrates what the principle is in two ways. By textual commentary, it defines and values the principle, and by narrative moments that manifest the principle, or that exhibit the principle. So to stay with the former example, if you are defining self-assess affirmatively, then you could quote and analyze Pedro Romero's clean line with maximum exposure to let the bull know that he was, and how Pedro keeps his head down and does not look to the stands for praise. So he wears this bull down beautifully, gracefully, with great courage. He's completing the tasks well, kills the bull quickly, honorably, but he doesn't look to the crowd for applause. He's embarrassed by being pushed up by the crowd and buoyed and floating through the crowd as they are celebrating him. He only does it for himself. He gains great confidence and self-awareness by being a great bullfighter, and actually wipes out the fight that he loses with Robert Cohn earlier on. So for those of you that haven't gotten that far in the course and haven't read The Sun Also Rises, that may not make a lot of sense. But that's just an example of how to define by negation and define by affirmation. Obviously, you can define by negation once or twice, but affirmation multiple times in your paper. Let's look at In Our Time and how this Moments in Our Time could show both coded and uncoded characters who follow certain principles and fail to follow certain principles. So let's look at the first one, which is self-pity, right? We all live in struggles against destruction, so don't eddy in your own weakness or despair about these forces outside of your control, because that will lead you to fail to act. Well, here's an example in Our Time. If we go into the chapters, remember the chapters, those little paragraphs aren't really chapters, and we get this character in a foxhole, and he says, the narrator writes, he lay very flat and sweated and prayed, "Oh, Jesus Christ, get me out of here. Dear Jesus Christ, get me out. If you only keep me from getting killed, I'll do anything you say. I'll believe in you, and I'll tell everyone in the world that you're the only one that matters." The next night, back at the Mestra, they did not tell the girl he went upstairs with at the Villa Rosa about Jesus, and he never told anybody. So here we have this blurting out, this leaking, this emotional leaking, this desire for an outside force of divine providence to come in and save him from being killed in World War I. And clearly he's saved because he's back in the town, in the village, but he goes to Villa Rosa, which we know is a whorehouse, with a whore upstairs, and he didn't tell her about Jesus, never told anybody about Jesus. So here's an individual who is pitying himself so much he is seeking an outside force for divine intervention, a force that ultimately Hemingway believed did not exist. And he finds this is an example of someone who does not follow this code principle, that takes such pity on himself that he is asking for divine intervention as opposed to doing something to help his situation to make it out alive. Example of a code breaker here. being faithful to and in love. So remember, he wants you to take risks in love as an antidote to despair, as a cleansing from what's been done to you beyond your control, and to maintain fidelity in love. Well, here's it early on in the short story collection In Our Time. We have 3-Day Blow. We have Bill and Nick discussing what's wrong with being in a relationship. And Bill says, "You're very wise, Wimage." "What do you mean?" asked Nick. "To bust off that Marge business," Bill said. "I guess so," said Nick. "It was the only thing to do. If you hadn't, by now you'd be back home working, trying to get enough money to get married." Nick said nothing. "Once a man marries," says Bill, "he's absolutely bitched. He hasn't got anything more. Nothing. Not a damn thing he's done for you. You've seen those guys that get married," and he goes on to say, "they get that fat married look." Nick said nothing. So here we have that cycled dialogue moment of Nick saying nothing, but Nick thinking inside about, I don't agree with Bill. I'm not courageous enough to tell Bill I don't agree with him. But Nick clearly thinking about Marjorie, thinking about how much he loves her, about how he is regretting busting it off with Marjorie. And these first few days, without Marjorie around, he spends time speaking, with Bill and drinking too much and really not getting anywhere in his life. So here's an example of a code breaker. Nick not being strong enough to tell Bill what he thinks. Nick not being strong enough to actually act on his love and being faithful to love. And we see this cycled through Krebs, who likes to look at girls walking down the streets after World War I in Kansas City, but he can't do anything about it. He can't get in relationships because he's so emotionally disabled. We see it in Mr. and Mrs. Elliot, in The Couple in the Out of Season, Cat in the Rain. These are failed relationships, we assume, post-World War I soldiers who are so emotionally disabled that they cannot engage with their wives, with their girlfriends, and love does not become an antidote to despair. Certainly code breakers. The next code principle in Our Time is completing tasks well. We'll remember that it means to maintain discipline in the honor and the means by which you complete tasks, in the striving for noble ends, and to finish what you start as best you can. So there's an honor, there's a sense of confidence that's developed in the self by doing things well as best one can, even if that means you cannot ultimately affect positive change. So here we have an example in Our Time of a code breaker, someone who can't complete tasks well. The first matter is a bullfight post-World War I. The first matter got the horn through his sword hand, and the crowd hooted him out. The second matador slipped, and the bull caught him through the belly, and he hung onto the horn with one hand and held the other tight against the place, and the bull rammed him against the barrier. Rammed him against the place, and the bull and the barrier, and the horn came out, and he lay in the sand. Then he got up like a crazy drunk and tried to slug the man carrying him away, and he yelled for his sword, but he fainted. And the kid came out to kill 5 bulls, because you can't have more than 3 matadors in a bullfight. And during the last bull, he was so tired he could hardly get the sword in. He could hardly lift his arm. He tried 5 times, so bad sticking here, right? And the crowd was quiet because it was a good bull, and it looked like him or the bull. And then he finally made it. He sat down in the sand and puked, and they held a cape over him while the crowd hollered and threw things down into the bull ring. So here's an example of a boy actually ultimately completing the task well, but all the bad sticking, all the bad matadoring, if that's a verb, has led to this cruelty toward the bull, this dishonoring of the bull, and really dishonoring of the institution of bullfighting. There's an inability to complete tasks well here. And there's great dishonor that comes from it. Well, the opposite, finally a moment in Our Time where someone completes tasks well or follows a code principle well, and that is in Big Torrid River, where Nick comes home and he goes fishing by himself to immerse himself in nature, to pour himself into making camp and making dinner, and to pour himself into fly fishing well so that he can create a sense of self that he believes in to run orders through chaos. And so here's an example of Nick fly fishing. The rod under his lift in his right arm. Nick stopped, dipping his right hand into the current, wetting his hand so that he does not harm the trout, the protective layer on the trout. He held the trout never still with his moist right hand while he unhooked the barb from his mouth, then dropped him back into the stream. As far as I can tell, in 1925, this is the first example of catch and release in fly fishing, There's a sense of contributing to the whole of the ecosystem, of valuing nature here, but clearly completing tasks well. There is an unspoken code in fly fishing to handle the trout gently, to handle the trout in a way that won't harm it, and catch and release allows that trout to contribute back, go back to the whole of the ecosystem, and allow that ecosystem to be complete and robust. So here's Nick beginning to follow a code principle, beginning to exhibit this principle of code that gives him confidence, that runs orders through chaos, that gives him some sense of belief that he can impose his will onto this chaotic world, this world of violence. And as long as he lives by the emerging principles of the code, he's going to be okay. But we're at the very early stages of Hemingway working out the code principle in young Nick Adams. I hope this is helpful in formulating your understanding of the code principles as the course goes on. And you can certainly come back to this lecture, this video lecture, when you are writing about In Our Time, and you're writing ultimately about a code principle. And you can use In Our Time as a text to show both coded individuals and coded behavior and uncoded behavior. And I look forward to reading them.